Good morning. Thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Elisabeth Varon, and I will be moderating this panel exploring the intersection of data privacy and competition in the platform economy. First, why does it matter to explore the intersection of privacy and competition in the platform economy? Answer is easy. Look at us. We are meeting and running this session thanks to a digital platform. We see that the development of digital services and platforms is impacting our daily lives. Digital services are expanding and generating more and more data. And this huge amount of data is in itself generating new services and practices. Some of them, in particular in relation to digital advertising, have become increasingly sophisticated and trigger questions and challenges in terms of impact on our fundamental rights. At the same time, data collected through such new technologies are an important asset and are the core of the platform economy. This has created a situation where large platforms control important ecosystems in the digital economy, also triggering competition law questions. The data economy is a key element of the digital agenda for Europe. And during the last year or so, the European Commission has presented several legislative proposals, which we have been already discussing this morning: the DSA, DMA, Data Governance Act, regulation on European approach for artificial intelligence, not to mention the e-privacy regulation that is still pending. These legislative proposals aim at fostering innovation, economic growth, and competition, creating a level playing field for all actors of the digital and data economy, and at the same time protecting our fundamental rights. During this session, our panelists will explore the challenges and opportunities created by the platform economy from different angles, from a policymaker point of view, from a regulator point of view, and also from a business point of view. Before starting the discussion, let me introduce our panelists of today. First, Professor Ulrich Kelber. Professor Kelber is Federal Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information for Germany. Before that, he has been a member of the German Bundestag for nearly 20 years, occupying the position of Parliamentary State Secretary in the Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection for 5 years. Mrs. Pascale Deschamps. Mrs. Deschamps is Deputy General Rapporteur at the Autorité de la Concurrence in France. She leads the team in charge of antitrust cases in digital and telecom markets. Before taking that role, she has been a partner at Auxerra in Brussels and Paris, and has acted as a non-governmental advisor for the Autorité de Concurrence. Mr. Paul Tang. Mr. Tang is a senior member of the European Parliament for Socialists and Democrats. Mr. Tang is part of the negotiation team of the Digital Services Act and Digital Market Act. He co-founded the Tracking Free Ads Coalition within the European Parliament. He is an economist by training and focuses on the regulation of data-driven advertising, in particular, questions of dominance in the ecosystem and our traditional media. Now, Mrs. Linda Tilova. She is DPO and Head of Privacy Center of Excellence at OneTrust, most widely used platform to operational privacy, security, and data governance. She's responsible for overseeing OneTrust data protection strategy to ensure global compliance, and her team is responsible for legal guidance and privacy content in data guidance and on OneTrust platforms. And last but not least, Mrs. Gerardine Proust. She is Director for Public Affairs at FEDMA, the Federation of European Data and Marketing, and she's focusing on the implementation of the GDPR and updating FEDMA Code of Conduct on the processing of data in line with the GDPR. As you see, we have an amazing panel today. So let me first turn to Professor Kelber for his introduction remarks on our topic of the day on the intersection of privacy and competition in the platform economy. Professor Kelber, may I turn to you?
Good morning, thank you. And firstly, thank you for having me. I'm glad being able to join this session as it focuses on one of the most crucial aspects of digitization we are facing now and in the years to come, at least from a data protection standpoint. Especially social media platforms have become an everyday aspect for the lives of the vast majority. They are the place where people communicate and get the bulk of their information on about every topic possible. Therefore, they have reached a level of influence that some people call alarming. In addition, as digital life has steadily shifted to these platforms, they have the ability to collect and analyze its users' data to a point at which there are almost no more secrets. Privacy and social media platforms do not seem to align these days. Therefore, as a counterweight, the GDPR in principle introduced many tools to ensure data protection compliance, also and especially at these platforms. And while it's true that the GDPR has achieved a great deal nationally, in Europe and worldwide, it still seems to be the case that limiting the power of the dominant US technology companies is and will remain the unresolved challenge for a long time. Even the much discussed and exemplary German Corona warning app is technically dependent on Apple's and Google's smartphone systems. In the pandemic crisis, the power of these US giants has continued to rise. The GDPR should actually provide a toolbox for the supervisory authorities to protect from this power people's right to self-determination, which is laid down in data protection law. So all European supervisory authorities must therefore finally make better use of the cooperation procedure within the European Data Protection Board, which is regulated in the GDPR. The existing procedure must also be filled with life in the case of extensive, fundamental, and cross-border procedures. It will be crucial for the data protection authorities of the EU member states to make effective use of these possibilities offered by the GDPR. With regard to large international data groups, it is therefore more than annoying that in Europe it was only possible to decide on one of the group's problematic behavior in terms of data protection law. I call the often responsible lead supervisory authorities from Ireland and Luxembourg to present draft decisions on these major cases to the EDPB. If we do not soon achieve to close the legal proceedings pending for more than 3 years against Facebook, Amazon, Google, and co., we can largely write off the reputation and acceptance of the whole set of rules. The GDPR creates the legal framework, but this framework must also be enforced through concrete action. Much needs to change, especially in the implementation of European data protection law, in order to be able to, at all, to set these limits. Cooperation between competition protection offices and data protection offices will become increasingly important. In Germany, the data protection authorities, we have a number of them, cooperates closely with the Bundeskartellamt, our national antitrust authority. Lawmakers gave the Bundeskartellamt more tools regarding data-driven companies in the recent past, and the now forming coalition is planning to extend these abilities of data protection authorities on the one side and the Bundeskartellamt even further. The business practices of technology companies is encountering more and more political resistance, beside European Parliament, not least in US Congress. Again, arguments relating to competition law play a decisive role. To sum it up, there's still a long way to go, and I hope that the new legislation on European level, such as the Digital Service and the Digital Markets Act, will bring us one step closer to the much-needed regulation in this area. A part of this has to be the cooperation between the antitrust authorities, the data protection authorities, and maybe new authorities created by these regulation on the European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remark. And speaking about the cooperation between the antitrust authorities and data protection authorities and new authorities to be foreseen under the new legislative proposals, let me turn to Mrs. Deschamps. Mrs. Deschamps, as Deputy General Rapporteur for the French Competition Authority, what can you share with us on our topic today?
So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Elizabeth, for this introduction. Yes, so I'm in charge at the French Competition Authority of the cases that are in the digital markets, and in particular in the edtech sector, where, of course, we are confronted on a regular basis with practices that have a dimension of privacy concerns in addition to antitrust concerns. But let me start first by reminding maybe everyone that we actually enforce, so the privacy regulators and the competition regulators enforce different parts of the law, privacy rules on one hand and competition rules on the other. Sometimes those rules go hand in hand, as in more competition leads to better privacy. If you think that privacy is a dimension of competition that actually matters for consumers, then if you have more competition, companies will try and attract users with more privacy settings. We saw the beginning of that with the WhatsApp changes in settings that led to Signal or Telegram earlier to get some traction, if not a lot of traction. But there are cases where there is tension between competition needs and privacy needs. So in particular, when in order to have better competition, you would need more data flows that raises privacy concerns. And if when raising privacy controls, you actually limit competition, that's when you have tension between the two objectives. So having said that, we've had cases, actual cases, at the junction of privacy and competition law from the perspective of the practices themselves, from the part of the companies, but also in the context of imposing remedies in order to solve a particular competition concern. So on the first type of concerns, so illegal practices, we have actually a duty to ask for the opinion of the privacy regulator in France when we have a case where there are privacy dimensions to a particular practice. Now, one of the cases where that happened is a decision that was taken earlier this year in March in the context of an update of the iOS operating system on iPhones, a setting called the ATT, so a new window for those of you who have iPhones and iPads, a new window that asks you for your consent to provide information to third parties in the context of advertising. So allow the app to track you or not to track you. So we actually got a complaint and a request for interim measures. And in that context, we asked the CNIL what they thought about this new prompt introduced by Apple. And the response by the privacy regulator was very positive. Then we took that into account when assessing whether we believe there was an anti-competitive practice behind that new framework imposed by Apple. And the conclusion in that decision was that prima facie, so in the context of an interim measure decision, there was no concern to be had. So that was an interesting example where we had this interaction. Another one is in the context of imposing remedies that would involve sharing data with competitors. So we've had cases like that in the energy sector where we imposed on previously monopoly to open their database of consumer contacts with third parties. So in order to comply with privacy rules, there was an opt-out clause. So as a consumer, you could actually refuse to get your information transferred like that. The opinion that we get from the privacy regulator always carries a lot of weight. Is taken into very serious consideration that, as is actually illustrated by the iOS decision in March, where we make extensive quotes of the opinion from the CNIL. In all those cases, we actually get a formal opinion from the CNIL, but it's not in the public domain, so it's for our own consumption. We also have a lot of informal discussions. More generally, we have discussions of principles with them outside cases. We do some cross-training. They train us, we train them. And we keep each other informed of developments that are relevant to each other. So most commentators in this area advocate for more coordination between regulators. And I have to say, maybe it doesn't work everywhere fine in France when it comes to other regulators. But on this particular one, I have to say our perception is that it's working very well, and that we try bilaterally to take into account each other's objectives when thinking about a particular practice, whether from a privacy angle or from a competition angle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your very practical experience in the cooperation between the competition and data protection authorities. I think it's very interesting to see how it works in practice. Let me now turn to Mr. Tang for a view on the topic from a senior member of the European Parliament. Mr. Tang?
Yes, thank you. And it's good to be taking part in this conference, and especially this session, which broadens the discussion, not focusing only on privacy, but broadening it to competition. And that is exactly what I try to do in a discussion on the ongoing discussion on the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act. I have particularly taken aim at the use of personal data, sensitive personal data, since what we see is that there are large corporations, that's American big tech, gathering, tracking and targeting users, and that is not only evading privacy, but also leads to recommender systems which bring forward the dissemination of fake news and inflammatory content, to the breeding of conspiracy theories, all just to get and keep the attention of the users, because it's a ad-based model, and Facebook is for 98% financed by advertisement. So advertisement is their core, and for that they need to keep and get attention, and for that they use Facebook and Google use the personal data. Now, the idea is, and I think that is now more and more shared, that if we would have enforced a GDPR, that alone will make a serious dent in the market for digital advertisement, personalized ads in particular, and that is also the basis of the compromise we have found in the Digital Market Act, which will be voted in plenary next week or 2 weeks from now. But it's not just that. What has surprised me during the debates is that what you see, there's a very dominant position of mainly Google and Facebook, but Amazon is upcoming in the market for digital personalized ads, and that alone would also be a reason to correct this market. There's an accumulation of market power, not in favoring the users. And this brings me to my third point, because to broaden the debate, if you start to think about it, what's happening, what we see, there's anecdotal evidence, but suggesting that on every euro spent on digital ads, at least 50 cents goes to Google and Facebook. The market for digital ads is growing, but a large chunk of the money that is made from digital ads is going to Google and Facebook. And this is to the detriment of the traditional media, of newspapers, public broadcast companies. They become the poorer for it. And I think that for a well-functioning democracy, we had to have these newspapers and broadcast companies to have diversity, to have them independent, so that they fact-check news. So what we see is that the public discourse is already changing on social media. Inflammatory content pays off, right? It keeps the attention, but also we weaken the more traditional media. So I'm very happy to have this panel, because I think we should have a broader view, privacy, competition, but also media, to really to have the focus on changing this market and better serve our society. And let me conclude, I'm just all the more happy that I see supervisors more and more working together to make sure that we enforce the European laws we already have. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your views on what's happening also at the level of the European Parliament, and are broadening the debate, also including traditional media. I think it's really important in our society to not to leave that outside of the debate. Let me now turn a little bit more on the business views of the questions, and turn to Linda Tilova. Linda, you are the head of Privacy Center of Excellence at OneTrust, a platform to operationalize privacy and data governance. In your views, what is this interplay between competition and privacy in the platform economy?
Thank you so much for that question, Elizabeth. And I wanted to say I'm very, very happy that I'm able to participate in today's session, because actually within the Privacy Center of Excellence, as well as within OneTrust, we see surprising amount of connectivity between the competition and privacy in general. And I think what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to, I guess, advocate for is the pathway in terms of how do we actually move from, let's say, the blend compliance with laws and I guess the primary step of compliance, which is let's avoid fines, let's make sure that we comply with the applicable privacy laws. And how do we actually elevate that into something that actually makes the business successful in terms of the competition, and how to elevate the privacy into a competitive advantage for organizations, each one of them. And I think, as lofty as this sounds, I think there is a real tangible pathway for us to achieve that as businesses. So what we're trying to focus on is really build that operational pathway where we can start by saying, okay, we have been focusing on avoiding fines, but can we maybe focus on what is the best practice? And I think that's the next logical step for most businesses when they're worrying about privacy, to start focusing on, well, maybe we have been worrying a little bit too much about the law, and at the end of the day, what we're doing right now might be innovative and there might not be exact clause in the law that's covering it. So let's focus on the best practices out there. Let's focus on the general guidance. And most of the times what we're seeing businesses go for to simplify things is to adopt the highest standard broadly, globally, in terms of the privacy levels. And also another point that is really helpful is focusing on the privacy principles of transparency, principles of fairness. And those principles, when really done well within the organization, are actually those building blocks for building trust with the consumers, building trust with your users. And through that trust, I think that's where the businesses can start achieving that competitive advantage within the market, because suddenly the users will not be wondering, oh my gosh, what are you going to do with our data once you collect it? Because they will know, because you tell them. And not only you tell them, you not only talk the talk, but you also walk the walk in terms of implementing measures to ensure that what you are doing with the data is actually in line, not just with one particular privacy law, but it's encompassing the best practices of privacy. And in order to do that, I appreciate that this is a long journey to take, but we definitely do have things like privacy enhancing technologies that can help us and that can help pave the way for us. Things like cryptographic algorithms, data masking techniques, some of them that you might be already familiar with because they are something that we know, like data minimization, but there's definitely more to it as well. We can leverage AI algorithms, but as amazing as these names and technologies sound, we still want to make sure that in the center of it all is the idea around elevating privacy and making sure that we designate these measures and these technologies to this, I guess, underlying goal of making privacy and trust in the center of what we're doing as a business. And we will be seeing that revenue come in as a result of us actually gaining competitive advantage over those businesses, which might be just obfuscating their privacy methods. So definitely I see the intersection between privacy and competition very, very clearly there.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for bringing this also the side of the opportunities of being privacy or privacy compliant and seeing privacy as a competitive advantage and the use of privacy and enhancing technologies. I think we will come back on that a bit later. Now let me turn to, we have been discussing digital advertising, and of course this is at the center of this platform economy. Mrs. Proust as the Director for Public Affairs at FEDMA, the Federation of European Data and Marketing. Can you share your views on this? I know you are not limited to digital marketing, and you cover broader marketing and advertising activities, but can we have your views on those topics and the interplay with competition and privacy?
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And there are indeed interlinks between data protection and competition. And I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss this. As you said, European data and marketing covers all channels of communication, B2B and B2C, online and offline. And across all channels, relevance of advertising remains the key factor. Both for SMEs and for consumers. Consumers prefer to receive relevant advertising, and relevant advertising in turn is more efficient, especially for SMEs on a tight budget, sometimes 500 euros. So how to achieve a thriving environment that's powered by users' trust? That's really the link here between our data protection and competition. And FEDMA, I would like to highlight for FEDMA three points to this debate. The first point I'd like to highlight is that we recommend transparency over bans. So, for example, a transparency over a ban on targeted advertising. And we are very pleased to see that the Council's general approach on DSA goes in this direction. Increased transparency will provide balance between privacy and competition, and will foster competition, as confirmed recently in a study by the Observatory of the Online Platform Economy. Also, banning targeted advertising would be would impact too strongly and unfairly SMEs, especially in a COVID context where online has taken more importance, and it might create a significant setback in the economic recovery, and at the same time favor larger companies. So. As I was saying, transparency is a preferred route, is a recommended route, and FEDMA supports the EDA program, which educates and fosters transparency around targeted advertising. And during its most recent annual summit last month, the Italian DPA joined this event and confirmed that education is key, and also confirmed that it's possible to find balanced solution through multi-stakeholder dialogue and self-regulation, such as the EDA. So that was my first point. My second point is regarding the GDPR. FEDMA recommends a balanced and efficient implementation of the GDPR, as many keynote speakers said before, that it's the anchor to data protection. So a consistent and balanced interpretation of the GDPR is important. And this means also supporting legitimate interests for the processing of data. Legitimate interest drives economic development in a privacy preserving manner. And data marketing, direct marketing, is recognized in Recital 47 as a legitimate interest. And so with appropriate legitimate interest assessment and safeguards, legitimate interest can drive fairer competition than consent, which tends to favor and facilitate walled gardens. Finally, and this is my third point, we recommend to align future legislations on the GDPR, its principle-based approach, its risk-based approach, and to avoid contradictions between legislations, and also avoid that legislations provide advantages to gatekeepers. So this is, for example, the challenge that there is within the e-privacy on the question of cookies, access to the user terminal, and also telemarketing. It's also an issue. It's also a point of discussion within the DMA, and FEDMA, we support the DMA efforts to foster competition. For example, we think that there should be strengthening of price transparency and access to measurement data for advertising services, and also to align better with GDPR and precisely to foster competition. There is opportunity here for legitimate interest to be used, for example, to help business users have access to data that's generated by end users on platforms. And this could be done also on legitimate interest, which would foster competition. So to sum up, we need to reduce the risk that the EU should become an over-regulated island. And we need to avoid contradiction and overlaps between legislations to foster competition. And we also need to support self and co-regulation tools to sustain users' trust, and continue to support and strive for a harmonized and balanced interpretation of the GDPR, especially in terms of the use of all legal bases for processing data. So that's it for me now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for your introduction remarks. I see that it's generating questions already in the chat, and although I have questions for the panel, I think there is one question that directly links to what has been said earlier, and especially in terms of mentioning that you could see privacy as a competitive advantage. And the question here in the chat is, privacy, you see privacy as competitive advantage, but isn't it in opposition to the theory of data as competitive advantage? And what is the most true, privacy as competitive advantage or data as a competitive advantage? And I would like to ask our panelists to answer that very interesting question that we had on the chat. Maybe I know turning to our Professor Kelber first on this question, and then on the other panelists.
I think it's a crucial point, and that's always in the debates in Germany with associations, with private persons, with the parliament. So first, privacy is a fundamental right, and there is no scenario where the regulation will really get all these obligation to comply with privacy will be gone in the European Union. So we have privacy to make an advantage, a unique selling point on world markets. And that's we have two possibilities. The first one is that the trust of consumers in Europe and worldwide that products and services from Europe are secure on the cybersecurity side and safe on the privacy side is one thing which is different to services and products from other regions in the world. And there is a market for that, not only in Europe and in the countries which are following the same path, like Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Brazil, India, which are on the way to have a data or privacy regulation like in Europe. But even for consumers and companies worldwide, which have to comply with the regulation in the different world regions if they work. And the second thing is the normal way, the standard way for example, artificial intelligence algorithms to work is these data lakes like these US and Chinese companies are creating. And there will be a number of sets of data where they have an advantage because they have access to that data, and European companies doesn't have that. But there are much more and more quality standard data on there to have for that technologies, but not for creating data lakes and copying these private and personal data worldwide, but for example in regulated centers where the algorithms goes to the data and learn on it. The final idea is about, for example, federated learning. That means I have on my mobile devices data it will never share with anybody outside. But if I can trust in the service and the product, I can consent in a software learning on my personal data, profiting myself from the results and sharing the outcome, the idea, the learning effect with the network of this software. And if this technology is promoted in Europe, this will be an advantage on the world markets too.
Thank you, thank you. Maybe Mr. Tang on this on this balance and which one is more true? Are privacy as a competitive advantage or data as a competitive advantage? And can we reconcile both?
Yeah. Now let me start by saying that I believe we ain't seen nothing yet, right? So the possibilities of exploiting data in general, artificial intelligence, augmented machine learning, we are still at the beginning, so we have a lot to learn still. It's what economists call general purpose technology. So I think the data are a new element in our economy, and learning from those data will bring great progress. However, when it comes to personal data and how it's being used, I have my severe doubts that the use of personal data is a big advantage for two reasons. The first one, saw the panic at Facebook when Apple introduced in its recent iOS the option not to be tracked. Apparently, Facebook fears very much that the users will not want this option, right? So that's the first. So on the user side, I think a lot of people prefer their privacy, not to be tracked, not to be targeted. But also from the side of the suppliers, the publishers, we have seen interesting, well, let's call them experiment with contextual advertising, which have been rather successful and even benefiting the small publishers, showing that the idea of personalized ads is also a marketing trick in itself, claiming to be effective. But what I've seen on research, I don't think it's that effective. And the alternative, contextual advertising, is certainly as effective as personalized ads. So making me doubt that the use of personal data is a competitive advantage. And then having this somewhat broader perspective, even if it would be a competitive advantage, it may not be the competitive advantage we should allow as society, right? Because the use of personal data in advertising, but also in the recommender system, leads very much to a troubled public discourse and has a negative social impact on our society. So that alone would be a reason to prevent the use of personal data in recommender system and advertising.
Thank you. And maybe having the view on Mrs. Deschamps on the same question around this competitive advantage from a point of view of our competition authority. How do you see this balance?
Yeah, so I think there is no one answer, and it's going to matter very much on the case. And sorry, a lot of typing in the background. Sorry. Okay. So it's going to depend on the case. And Paul mentioned the case that I also mentioned earlier about the iOS prompt, which indeed Facebook was quite concerned about. In fact, made public announcements about the dent it's having on its advertising profits. Having said that, I've also seen studies that say that it's about 50% less income when you don't actually use a targeted advertising. Now, I appreciate it very much depends on who you are, whether you're a game app developer, whether you're a newspaper, whether you're an online distribution platform, or any other kind of content, depending on what you are actually doing as an app, as a publisher. The impact of reduction in targeting possibilities is going to have a diverse impact. Now, privacy as a competitive advantage, I think you could see some of it in the context of the WhatsApp change in privacy settings that we saw earlier with the uproar in public opinion saying, how dare you? I mean, you can do it only because you're Facebook, as opposed to, so because you have market power, you can relax privacy settings, which, in a way is at the crux of market power from a competitive advantage, from a competition standard to what you do with privacy settings. In markets where you have some competition, so not the market where Facebook is in, privacy can actually be a competitive reinforcement tool, as in it will be a dimension of competition that competitors will compete on in addition to price. But if it's zero, then of course you're not going anywhere below zero. But other dimensions of quality, easiness of use, and other dimensions. In markets where there's already domination, and there are a number of those, Facebook, but not only, privacy is going to be a victim of more data collection, because it's actually a way for market power to express itself. So in a way, you're gonna reduce privacy settings to get more power to continue to feed your dominance. So in a way, that's where you see that depending on the case, the privacy settings are going to be a competition enhancement aspect, or are going to be victim of a lack of competition. And in the case of Facebook earlier this year, there was an uproar, but the reality is that a few months down the line, it changed nothing, right? There's still as many people on WhatsApp. The Signals and previously Telegrams of this world are still very much struggling tremendously to actually get a foothold in those markets, even though they have better privacy settings. I mean, maybe some of them actually don't compete very well on the other dimensions of competition in this market. Ease of use, for example, a Signal on par with WhatsApp on a number of other dimensions. I don't know. I mean, that's clearly for consumers to decide, but it clearly isn't easy to be competing in those markets on the basis of privacy settings alone, but it is one dimension. It's just that in some cases, it actually really goes against the financial interest of those firms. And if they have market power, they will clearly play the financial interest first.
Okay, thank you. Noted. Mrs. Tilova, you mentioned privacy as a competitive advantage, but at the same time, you also mentioned and talked about privacy-enhancing technologies. And I'm wondering whether privacy-enhancing technologies are not then providing the competitive advantage. What do you think?
That's a great call out, and I really enjoyed all of the remarks of the other panelists. I would particularly come back to what Professor Kalber mentioned about trust, because I think actually trust is the key to solving this dilemma. Because basically, if we look at this example in a broader sense, if I collect lots of data about a user, but then I misuse the data, I get kind of a short-term win, but the user, if they learn about it, they will be hopefully more reluctant to give me the data long-term. This is not a way to build long-term relationships. However, if I gain trust of the user through transparency, through those building blocks of privacy, leveraging potentially also PATs, the privacy-enhancing technologies, I can start building that trust as a long-term relationship element. And I can actually start getting more data and start building my competitive advantage. So one thing I would like to make very clear is that privacy as a competitive advantage does not preclude you from collecting large amounts of data if you need it, if there is a good reason for it, if you're transparent about how you're using it, if you're employing technologies to protect the data, if there's fairness in the way you're processing the data. I think that we are moving into a future where we are inevitably going to be processing large amounts of data, and we will be employing lots of AI, machine learning kinds of technologies around the data. But if we do so in a privacy-friendly way, in a transparent way, and if we show to the users what they're getting in return, we start building that relationship of trust. And to the example that Professor Kalber showed earlier, if we're doing so in a privacy-friendly, mindful manner, the users actually wouldn't mind because they know that this is done to their advantage. So in my view, there is a way to strike a balance between privacy and data sharing, and that balance is being struck through trust.
Thank you. And exactly on this data balance between privacy and data, Mrs. Proust, do you have views on that from a FedMar point of view?
Yes, I unmuted myself. Sorry for that. Yes, I think that it is a key question, this balance between data and privacy. And I'd like to come back to a quote which I'm sure most of you have already heard. It's that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. That was attributed to several different major marketers. But I'm referring to this quote because it shows that data can help businesses, especially SMEs, to send relevant advertising, which will be efficient, and therefore help them understand which is the 50% which is wasted, and how to be more efficient. But as was said, it is a question of balance. So a 360-degree view on the consumer is not always necessary for relevant advertising, and it will depend also on the context. On the data use, there can be safeguards put into place, such as pseudonymization, or anonymous data is also useful for advertising. And MEP Tang mentioned contextual advertising. There are indeed different forms of advertising. And as I said before, there are different online and offline ways of advertising. And just to give an example of offline advertising, direct mail, for example, and the use of legitimate interest for European SMEs is very important to give them this choice of channels to reach out to consumers, to help them be more competitive, and to reach out to potential prospects in a balanced way. Finally, on the question of privacy becoming a competitive advantage, this can also go through consumer education. So the more the consumer understands and knows about how things work, the more the consumer can make a trusted decision, which will also foster competition and companies who try to turn privacy into a competitive advantage. And EDA developed a education program, which is on their website, and so you can refer to that for more information.
Great, thank you. Let me go back to Mr. Tan to add maybe one or two points to the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, because hearing this discussion, 2 points come to my mind. First of all, that we need to have alternatives so that the user can choose, right? So when it comes to WhatsApp and Signal, after the uproar on the WhatsApp conditions, my football team changed to Signal, but I'm afraid that's the exception to the rule, that it's very hard to change towards away from WhatsApp. And this is exactly what the European Parliament wants to achieve in the Digital Market Act by putting much emphasis on interoperability, which is, let's say, a bit more technical term, to allow more competition and diversity. So give the user something to choose from, so that privacy really becomes an issue also in the consumer market, in the user market. The second, what I find, well, like I say, I'm an economist by training, but I find intriguing that it's the user. Not only it doesn't have much choice, but the product or service that the user buys is very unclear. So the model is usually based on advertising, which is very opaque. It would be very different if you want to have trust, and I would be willing to give my personal data if there's a one-to-one relation between the user and the provider of the services, and I can withdraw that agreement, which we usually have with products and other services. There's a very clear relation between user and the provider of the services. We don't see that currently in for example, in the social media platforms and the advertising use. So it's a very opaque business model, undermining the consumer sovereignty also. So use of personal data, yes, if it's a clear choice that the consumer or user can understand, that would be fine, but we're far from that situation.
Thank you. And I see there is a how are we going to strike this balance between more data on one side, more data on one side, and more privacy on the other side. And if we want to strike the balance between that, I see what we have been discussing this morning. I see two paths to that. First one is more laws, more regulations. The Commission's proposals are regulating and proposals to regulate online advertising, maybe a ban on certain types of digital advertising. There is another path, which is, and maybe we can combine the two, of course, but the other one is more enforcement from data protection authorities, more collaboration with the different authorities, and making sure that the enforcement is harmonized in Europe and between the different types of authorities that would intervene in the field. And I have no questions for each of you, maybe on the different paths to achieve that more privacy, together with more data or less data, depending on your position. But what path do you think is the more efficient? Which one should we focus on, or should we focus, of course, on both? So I have that question for the different panelists. I've seen a question also in the chat discussing enforcement in the UK, for example, and really creating joint authority. Is that something that is foreseen in other member states under the legislation or the legislative proposals in the EU? So I don't know if who would like to start on this one, maybe on the question of the authorities and the and more enforcement, and what the authorities can play, which role they can play. Maybe Mrs. Deschamps, is it something you would like to cover first, on the corporation enforcement, maybe risk of seeing different authorities with different enforcement or decisions that are not aligned?
So partially because things are changing, right, with the DMA, and in particular the role of competition agencies, right? So at the moment we're enforcing competition law, and that's pretty much what there is with privacy law and consumer law, of course. But in a way, it's all decentralized when it's not competition, European Commission cases, of course. With the DMA, the Commission is going to be sole enforcer. And that means that on the privacy side, I have to say, I have no idea how that's going to work, given that at the moment, the privacy considerations are pretty much at national level. So that interaction in a way with the DMA, we're going to have to see how it's getting sorted. At the moment, I know for France, the idea of what the UK's done is not on the table, as far as I'm aware. Maybe the reason is because it works in practice. So as much as the French like bureaucracy, maybe that's one of the instances where there's no need to add more. So, and there are other fora, by the way. There are other fora where regulators meet with a bunch of others. I just wanted to make one comment about your sort of debriefing of the previous discussion, because I see another path. You were talking about the enforcement regulation. There's technology. And in fact, it's already happening, right? How do you actually make, in particular in advertisement, those technologies less intrusive while still being useful from a targeting perspective? And of course, you talk about cohorts, how do you actually go, basically you go as low as you can at the user level, and nothing comes out of the phone or PC that the person is using. Everything that goes out is very much in the pack. I'm not saying that's a silver bullet. My only point is to say we need to give a chance to technology as well. From the moment we say the rules are now, we want more privacy, go on, do it. We're going to actually enforce it, as in if you don't do it, we're going to find a way that you actually do it that you don't like. But there might be ways that you like through technology. And I think that Linda was hitting to that through OneTrust, but I think others are also in that market. What we're going to have to see, and I think Professor Kelber mentioned earlier, do you allow the data to be transferred to training, but then you don't want it to go anywhere else but the training of those algorithms? I think some people would even resent sending it to the training. So, but some other people would be fine either way. So I think that these are still society choices that have not actually been resolved, and that we're still processing as we go. And in fact, if we'd had those conversations even 5 or 10 years ago, the privacy education level would have been much lower. At this now, there is that perception that it is an important thing that people should protect, also because we've had all these leaks and scandals and stuff. But at the same time, we're not there yet in terms of the maturity of the thinking about where exactly do we draw the line. And I have to say, very much like Professor Kelber's reminder, that privacy is a fundamental right. Competition isn't. At the same time, the more competition you have, the more secure you have actually about your data being where it should be, because otherwise there's going to be consequences on those markets. So it's a very fine balance to tread.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. I think we have heard earlier this morning talking about not privacy by design, but privacy by innovation. And I think it's linked to the third part you just described on technology. So now we have these 3 parts more. Do we need even more legislation? Are we going sufficiently far in terms of regulating use of data sharing, enforcement? But I fully agree with you that technology is also one of the parts. Maybe can I?
But they're complements. They're complements, right? I'm certainly not saying we shouldn't regulate, right? That's not,
for sure.
That's not my point.
Yeah. Sure. Maybe I don't know. Maybe Mrs. Silova, do you want to comment on this one?
Definitely. I really enjoy Pascal's points. I would say technology definitely has a role to play there. Maybe to comment on the other points that you've mentioned, Elizabeth, in terms of legislation, I think legislation is very, very helpful, but we want to make sure that we basically stick to legislation as a sort of high level kind of principles outlining piece of law, because as soon as we start to aim for tackling on every little detail of laws, it's just going to never work in terms of capturing the realities of how we're processing personal data. So from my point, I would rather, I guess, detract from the idea that legislation is just going to give us answers for everything. One more point to highlight here, and I think we've already heard it here today, that we are not alone in terms of trying to address privacy issues through legislation here in Europe. This is global movement. And what we're actually seeing happening globally is that businesses, instead of, I guess, focusing on specifics of Brazilian LGPD and figuring out the details there versus EU GDPR, businesses look at those, they see where they're similar, and they combine the, I guess, strictest privacy regime and apply it globally. So I would advocate for having a harmonized approach in terms of what we're proposing in terms of privacy legislation, because we need to take into consideration that not every business has a team of 100 lawyers to dissecate every privacy law out there. We want to think about the SMEs and think about having a clear-cut set of rules to follow. In terms of regulation through enforcement, I would say it's amazing to have regulators advocating and enforcing, but we can't push everything on enforcement action because it's just not possible to police everyone. So to Pascal's earlier point, I would love for regulators to actually weigh in on the new technologies, be it the privacy enhancing technologies or the use of technologies such as AI, and to try and pave the way in educating on the privacy technologies and enhancing technologies that are available out there to help most of us who are in the privacy sphere who might not have technology background kind of cut through the noise and to be able to fully contribute to those discussions with our, I don't know, product teams, marketing teams who are already in the middle of adopting these new ways of processing data, so that we can say, well, this is great, but maybe if we implement this, it will make things much easier for us in terms of transparency or in terms of securing the data. So I see that as a really pivotal role for the regulators rather than just clear enforcement action.
Thank you. And listening to you, I'm even thinking of there is a fourth part, or fourth way is also industry initiatives to help regulating that. But let me go back to Professor Kelber on those questions, and really how now we will combine all those more enforcement, our new legislative proposals, our technology and how we can put all of that together to reach, because what we're trying to do is to strike the balance between more data and more privacy.
As a computer scientist, I love the idea of privacy by design, privacy by innovation. And there are a lot of ideas and there are a lot of possibilities how to bring in technologies, letting people decide for what things they share their data for, profiling, for services, for the common good, like planning of mobility or research, medical research. But we can use technologies for having profiles only on handhelds, and my own device is deciding which ads it takes, and not presenting any of these profiles personally or as a shadow or dark profile to data-driven companies. The second question about the cooperation between the different authorities. So these days it's simple. We have the European cooperation among data protection authorities on the one side, and the same with the competition authorities. And we have on the national level the cooperation between the competition authorities and the data protection authorities. With DSA and DMA, a number of new ideas come in, of new authorities, of new levels, and of interaction between the regulations in DSA and DMA and GDPR. And for the proposals made by the Commission and the Council, not the proposals made by the EP, there are problems because this interaction is not clear. Which rules to follow, which is the cooperation between a centralized European authority in the DMA and the national data protection authorities and the EDPB and the European Data Protection Supervisory Authority. So supervisor. So that has to make clear in the trilogue, because otherwise we will have a disturbance between these three major European regulations.
Thank you. And on the same topic, let me just go to Mrs. Proust and then Mr. Tang, maybe. So, what do you wish to add to this interesting question and debate?
Thank you. Thank you. Regarding this more data, more privacy, I think that once again transparency can help, leaving channels of communication open to offer choices to SMEs that can also help and foster competition. We continue to support legitimate interest. Legitimate interest assessment requires to take into account the context, the data, the interests, and to take measures to ensure that there are safeguards in place. And I think it's very important to, from a regulating point of view, not favor gatekeepers. And that's where the DMA can really play an important role. And it can in particular play a role on preventing gatekeeper platforms from combining different sources of data among different services and data from third parties. So this is one thing where the DMA could push further on this, and push further for transparency on prices, within yes, on prices vis-a-vis advertisers and publishers. And as I previously said, but I'm coming back to this, I think it's important to enable business users to have access to personal data of their end users via these platforms, via legitimate interest, which will facilitate fair competition for these SMEs. And from a technological point of view, it's true that there is quite an evolutionary phase right now going on, a lot of discussions going on. And I think that it brings us back to the distinction between technology and GDPR and the legislation. And I think that Linda, you used an expression which I think I'm going to steal from you. You said we have to use the principles as building blocks. So I think that we should make a difference between the technology that's used. It's not necessarily ban technologies, but rather build on the principles of the GDPR. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very interesting. On coming back on the competition, because of course the question of more data is more data for everyone and for every business. And you mentioned the SMEs that shouldn't be forgotten in the in the whole play. Let me now turn to Mr. Tang for also your views on that, and on the legislative side also of things, and the combination with more enforcement, more technology, and of course the regulation and the legislation tries to be technology neutral. So there is also there a balance to be made.
Yeah, well, if you have four ways forward, enforcement, regulation, industry-based initiatives, and technology. I think technology has seen the most developments, and in other areas I see very much inertia. I think we come very late to the game, and that applies to industry-based initiatives, to enforcement, and to regulation. And what I see, sort of observe, is that sometimes, let's say, the problem is too big for the member states or the national authorities to handle, and that leads to an inertia. And while at the same time, European decision making is very slow. But we need now and then to make corrective decisions, I would say. And I'll take an example. What we have now seen is the initiative on political ads by Eurova, which I see as a corrective action, where we see influence of our democratic elections, and we want to stop this. We need to take action. And this is what I very much hope for also in the years to come, that we break through this inertia. We see better enforcement. I think that's absolutely, forcing the GDPR is crucial, I think. But I will also keep this debate alive, and then we also see at European level discussion on what are the way forward. How do we like technology to be used? How can we use the technology to our best interest, not only as an individual, but also as a society as a whole. Because I still see very much the focus very much on the users, control of data, but it's not just about the individual, it's about the society as a whole. But like I said, political ads is a perfect example that you need sometime to step in and correct a situation that needs to be corrected.
Okay, thank you very much, and let me thank all the speakers today. I think it was a very interesting debate, and we have seen that, of course, we have different points of view as a policymaker, regulator, businesses, but I see that ideas are converging into making sure that fundamental rights are respected in this digital economy, that everyone should benefit from the business and the growth of the economy based on data, but that we need to strike this balance. I think we reached the end of our session. I don't know if any of you wants to 1 minute final remarks. I open the floor to you if you want. I see we have a few minutes left. I don't see any other question in the chat, so if any of you has a final remark, please share it. Otherwise, I will thank the speakers. Okay, Great. So thank you very much for a very interesting debate, and our let's see what happens in in the coming months and what we have as new legislation for next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.